I never thought snow could be used as a weapon, until my HOA decided my land was the perfect place to bury their problems and dared me to complain. I used to believe I lived in a quiet, respectable neighborhood, the kind where people waved politely, kept their lawns trimmed, and pretended the HOA existed to protect property values. That illusion shattered the morning I opened my front door and saw a towering wall of filthy, chemical-stained snow sealing off my driveway like a prison gate. Not the street, not a shared area. My land. This wasn't clean snow either. It reeked of diesel, road salt, and whatever sludge plows scrape up from commercial lots. It was piled so high it blocked sunlight from reaching the small garden near my fence, the one my late wife, Emily, spent years nurturing during her illness. Watching that garden disappear under gray, toxic ice felt like losing her all over again. Inside the house, my situation was already fragile. My elderly Aunt Margaret, who depends on daily heart medication, lives with me. The snowbank meant no deliveries, no clear exit, and no safe way for emergency vehicles to reach us. When I called the HOA management number, expecting at least an explanation, I didn't get concern. I got attitude. The HOA president, Linda Carver, spoke to me like I was a child who should be grateful. She claimed the snow placement was temporary and done for community efficiency. When I argued that they had dumped everything directly onto my property, she calmly informed me I'd been cited for unsightly accumulation and fined $600 for failing to maintain my driveway. Let that sink in. They dumped the snow, then fined me for it. As plows idled down the street, I watched neighbors drive past in clean SUVs, barely slowing as they glanced at my buried home. No one asked if we were okay. No one questioned why every other driveway was spotless except mine. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. I pulled the violation notice from the envelope again and studied it more closely. The signature at the bottom didn't match mine. The wording referenced an agreement I'd never seen, let alone signed. 30 years working municipal maintenance taught me one thing. When paperwork smells wrong, it usually is. That night, while Margaret slept on the couch wrapped in blankets, I stood at the window staring at the snow mountain glowing under streetlights. The HOA thought they'd trapped a quiet homeowner who would pay the fine, clear the mess, and move on. They were wrong, because the next storm was coming, and this time I wasn't planning to clean up after them. By morning, the snow still hadn't melted, but my patience had completely disappeared. I woke up early, not because I wanted to, but because the cold had crept inside the house. The snowbank outside had turned into a frozen wall, reflecting the night chill straight back through the windows. Margaret was already awake, sitting quietly at the table with her medication laid out, staring at the driveway like it was an enemy. That look alone told me this had crossed a line far beyond inconvenience. I grabbed my old boots and stepped outside, climbing halfway up the icy pile just to see how bad it really was. From the top, the view was clear. The HOA plows had deliberately redirected every pass toward my property. Tire tracks curved away at the last second, dumping load after load onto my land while leaving the rest of the street clean and accessible. This wasn't overflow. This was targeted. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Close-ups of the plow marks, wide shots of my buried driveway, the untouched pavement just a few feet away. I even filmed the faded boundary marker near my fence, the one that clearly showed where HOA jurisdiction ended and my private property began. Years ago, a surveyor placed it after a minor dispute with a developer. At the time, it felt unnecessary. Now it felt like insurance. An hour later, a white HOA pickup rolled up. Two men stepped out wearing reflective vests, acting like they were there to help. One of them told me they'd get around to clearing my driveway once higher priority areas were finished. When I asked why my property was suddenly considered HOA storage space, his smile vanished. He warned me not to interfere with HOA operations, said any attempt to move the snow onto the street would result in additional fines. When I mentioned emergency access concerns, he shrugged and suggested I plan better in winter. That was the moment I realized reason wasn't going to work here. After they left, I dug out a metal lockbox from the garage. Inside were old property records, easements, and correspondence from decades back, documents most people throw away. I spread them across the kitchen table, comparing maps, signatures, and boundary notes. Something jumped out immediately. The HOA's claimed snow route ran directly through land they never legally controlled. They weren't just dumping snow, they were trespassing. That evening, another storm warning flashed on the news. Heavy accumulation expected overnight. I looked out at the half-buried street sign and then back at the paperwork in my hands. The HOA thought winter gave them cover to do whatever they wanted. But winter works both ways. And as the snow began falling again, I realized I didn't need to fight them with words. I just needed to use exactly what they'd dumped on me. By the time the second storm hit, I wasn't angry anymore. I was prepared. Snow started falling just after sunset, thick and heavy, the kind that doesn't drift politely but slams into the ground and stays there. I watched from the porch as the flakes piled onto the already massive mound the HOA had created. By midnight, my property looked like a frozen quarry. And right on schedule, just after 2 a.m., I heard it, the low mechanical growl of plows returning to finish what they started. This time, I didn't rush outside. I let them work. From my upstairs window, I filmed everything. The plow slowed near my driveway, angled its blade, and shoved another wave of snow directly onto my land. Then another, and another. Each pass added height, weight, and proof. When they finally left, the street behind them was spotless, almost mocking in contrast to the frozen barricade now sealing me in. At sunrise, I got to work. Using my own equipment, an old but powerful loader I used for clearing fallen trees, I began reshaping the snow. I didn't push it onto the road. I didn't touch HOA pavement. I simply compacted what was already on my property, stacking and reinforcing it along the exact boundary line shown on my survey maps. The result wasn't a messy pile. It was a solid, engineered wall of ice and snow. By mid-morning, neighbors started coming outside, confused. Cars slowed, people stared. The road now ended abruptly at a clean, frozen barrier. Technically, the street still existed, but access through my land was gone. I hadn't blocked their road. I had secured my property. The HOA president arrived less than an hour later, red-faced and furious. She demanded I remove the obstruction immediately. I calmly asked her to point out where I had crossed onto HOA land. She couldn't. Instead, she threatened fines, lawsuits, even police involvement. I handed her a copy of the boundary survey and the recorded footage of their plows dumping snow on my property. Her voice changed instantly. She tried a new angle, calling it a miscommunication, offered to have the snow removed later. But by then, the temperature had dropped again. The snow wall was no longer loose powder, it was solid ice. Heavy equipment would be required to move it, and any attempt would mean crossing onto my land without permission. For the first time since this started, the HOA had a real problem, because the only access route they relied on now depended entirely on me. And when emergency vehicles suddenly realized they couldn't pass, the HOA understood something terrifying. They had handed me leverage made of ice. The panic didn't start with the HOA. It started with sirens that suddenly went silent. Late that afternoon, I saw flashing lights at the far end of the street. An ambulance had pulled up, slowed, and stopped. The driver stepped out, looked at the frozen wall, then back at the road behind him. Within minutes, a fire department pickup arrived, followed by a police cruiser. None of them crossed onto my land. They didn't have to. The problem was obvious. The HOA's private street now had no usable exit. I walked out calmly, hands visible, phone recording. I explained exactly what happened. Snow dumped repeatedly on my property without consent, documented on video, reshaped entirely within my boundary. I showed the survey again. The officers exchanged looks. One of them nodded slowly and said the words the HOA feared most. "This is a civil matter." The HOA president showed up shortly after, breathless and frantic. This time there were no threats, no raised voice, just urgency. She asked, politely, if I could temporarily adjust the snow so emergency access could be restored. I told her I was willing to discuss it, but only with written acknowledgement that the snow dumping had violated my property rights and that it would never happen again. She refused. Instead, she tried pressure, claimed I was endangering residents, claimed I'd be liable if something happened. I asked why emergency vehicles had been relying on access through land they didn't own. That shut her up fast. The truth was uncomfortable. The HOA-approved road design had always cut across a corner of my property, unofficially, without easement, without agreement. They'd been gambling for years that I'd never push back. Now the temperature dropped again, locking the snow even harder. The fire department left after confirming alternate access routes, longer, slower, but legally passable. The ambulance rerouted. And just like that, the HOA's sense of control evaporated. That evening, letters started appearing in mailboxes. Not fines, apologies. Carefully worded notices about temporary access changes and weather-related complications. No mention of my name. No mention of responsibility. Behind the scenes, though, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Board members called individually, trying softer tones. One offered to pay for removal. Another suggested a shared maintenance agreement. I told them all the same thing. No more dumping, written acknowledgement, and compensation for damages already done. Silence followed. By morning, the HOA's street was still sealed, the snow wall now part of the landscape. Kids took pictures. Neighbors whispered. And for the first time, everyone realized the HOA didn't actually own what they thought they controlled. They'd treated my land like a convenience. Now it was a boundary they couldn't cross. But what really broke them wasn't the snow. It was the legal notice that arrived next, forcing them to confront how badly they'd miscalculated. The moment the legal envelope hit their office, the tone changed, from panic to pure damage control. I knew it before anyone said a word. Within hours of the notice being delivered, the HOA's usual silence was replaced by activity. Trucks slowed near the snow barrier. Board members stood in small clusters, phones glued to their ears, whispering like they were afraid the snow itself might hear them. This wasn't about winter anymore. This was about exposure. The notice was simple but precise. It outlined repeated unauthorized dumping, trespass, and property alteration. It included timestamps, photos, survey maps, and written warnings I'd sent months earlier, warnings they'd ignored. Most importantly, it demanded immediate cessation and compensation, or the issue would move forward formally. That's when the HOA tried to flip the script. They sent a letter claiming the snow pile was now a public safety hazard, and that I was responsible for removing it. I laughed out loud when I read it. The snow hadn't fallen from the sky onto their road. It had been pushed there by their contractors. I replied the same day, attaching footage of their plows dumping load after load onto my land, clearly marked with boundary stakes. That argument died quickly. Next came the emergency meeting. Residents were invited. Lawyers were present. I was invited too, but I declined. Instead, I sent a written statement that was read aloud. It laid out one point clearly. Access across my land had never been authorized, and any reliance on it was the HOA's problem, not mine. That's when murmurs turned into arguments. Homeowners started asking questions the board couldn't answer. Why had the snow always been dumped there? Why wasn't there an easement? Why were emergency vehicles depending on a route that wasn't legally theirs? The board tried to calm the room, but the confidence was gone. Outside, nothing changed. The snow wall stayed, temperatures kept it solid, and the HOA's options shrank by the hour. Behind the scenes, their attorney reached out to mine. The message was cautious, almost friendly. They wanted a temporary resolution so snow could be moved. I agreed under conditions: written acknowledgement of fault, payment for cleanup and land restoration, and a permanent end to all dumping and access across my property. They pushed back on the wording. I didn't budge. Days passed. The neighborhood adapted to longer routes. Complaints piled up. The HOA's inbox flooded with angry emails, not at me but at them. Every delay made it worse. Every attempt to pressure me only strengthened my position. Finally, late one evening, I got the message they'd been avoiding sending. They were ready to talk on my terms. The snow hadn't just blocked a street. It had exposed years of shortcuts, assumptions, and quiet overreach. And now, all of it was on record. But agreeing to talk was only the beginning, because what they offered next revealed just how desperate the HOA had become. When the HOA finally sat down to negotiate, I realized something shocking. They weren't prepared at all. The meeting wasn't held at their clubhouse. Instead, they chose a neutral office downtown, likely hoping the change of scenery would shift the balance. It didn't. From the moment everyone took their seats, it was clear they were scrambling. Papers were shuffled. Side conversations kept breaking out. Their confidence from earlier letters was completely gone. They opened with apologies, but not the real kind. These were carefully worded statements that avoided responsibility while pretending to be cooperative. They said the snow dumping was a miscommunication. They claimed contractors had assumed the land was part of the HOA's maintenance area. I let them finish. Then I slid a single document across the table. It was a land survey dated years before the HOA even existed. The room went quiet. I explained calmly that this wasn't about snow. It was about a pattern. For years, they'd treated my property like overflow space. Snow in winter, equipment parking in summer, temporary access whenever it suited them, and every time they assumed I'd stay quiet. That assumption was their biggest mistake. Their lawyer tried a new angle. He suggested an easement, retroactive, of course. I shut that down immediately. I had no interest in giving permanent access to an HOA that had already proven it couldn't respect boundaries. He then suggested compensation plus shared responsibility moving forward. Again, no. What I wanted was simple: acknowledgement, cleanup, and a legal guarantee it would never happen again. That's when the board president lost patience. She raised her voice, claiming the neighborhood was suffering because of me. She said emergency response times were affected. She said residents were angry. I responded with one question that changed everything. Why did you build your winter plan around land you didn't own? No one answered, because there was no good answer. I reminded them that I hadn't blocked a public road. I hadn't dumped snow anywhere. I'd simply stopped allowing trespass on my property. Everything else was the result of their choices. After a long pause, their lawyer asked for a private break. When they came back, the tone had shifted again, this time to concession. They agreed to pay for removal, restoration, and legal costs. They agreed to document all boundaries and notify contractors in writing. And they agreed that any future violation would trigger automatic penalties. The deal wasn't signed that day, but the framework was set. Outside, winter sun reflected off the snow barrier that had started it all. What they once saw as a dumping ground had become leverage. And leverage, when used correctly, changes everything. But just when I thought the fight was nearly over, an unexpected complaint from inside the neighborhood threatened to unravel the entire agreement. Just when the agreement felt solid, a single complaint from inside the neighborhood threw everything back into chaos. 2 days after the negotiation framework was drafted, I received an unexpected call, not from the HOA board, but from a resident. He sounded nervous, almost apologetic. He said he was calling off the record because something didn't sit right. According to him, the HOA hadn't been honest with its own members about what was happening. That alone raised alarms. He explained that the board had circulated a notice blaming me for blocking community access and creating a winter safety hazard. None of it mentioned the snow dumping. None of it mentioned my property lines. And none of it mentioned the pending agreement or their responsibility in the situation. Instead, they were quietly preparing a special assessment vote. That's when I realized the HOA wasn't just trying to fix a mistake. They were trying to shift the cost onto their residents. I immediately contacted my attorney. Within hours, we reviewed the HOA bylaws, meeting minutes, and notice requirements. What we found was worse than expected. The board was pushing through emergency measures without proper disclosure, hoping fear would override questions. And in doing so, they were opening themselves up to serious internal liability. The next morning, my attorney sent a formal notice, not just to the board, but to every HOA member who had a registered email on file. It outlined the facts clearly: where the snow came from, whose land it sat on, and what actions had already been admitted during negotiations. The response was explosive. Residents started replying, asking why they were being asked to pay for something caused by the board's decisions. Some demanded copies of the land survey. Others questioned why contractors weren't properly instructed. Within hours, the HOA office phone lines were overwhelmed. That afternoon, the board requested an emergency meeting, with me present this time. When I arrived, the room felt completely different from before. Gone was the defensive posture. Gone were the raised voices. Now board members were being questioned by the very people they represented, and they didn't have clean answers. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves. One resident asked the question that ended the meeting. "If this wasn't our land, why did you treat it like it was?" Silence followed. By the end of the session, the special assessment vote was withdrawn. The board agreed, on record, that all costs related to the snow dumping, legal fees, and cleanup would come from HOA reserves, not residents. They also agreed to an independent audit of contractor practices. Walking out, I realized something important. This was never just about snow or access. It was about accountability. And once the residents saw the truth, the HOA's leverage disappeared overnight. But as the dust settled internally, a new problem emerged, one that involved the city, not the HOA, and threatened to escalate things even further. Just when the HOA lost control internally, the city stepped in, and their timing couldn't have been worse. 3 days after the emergency meeting, a city inspector showed up at my property line. He wasn't aggressive, but he was cautious, clipboard in hand, camera ready. A complaint had been filed claiming I had created a public roadway obstruction by piling snow in a way that interfered with emergency access. I knew immediately where it came from. Even after backing down publicly, someone from the HOA had gone around the board and escalated it to the city, hoping official pressure would force me to move the snow for free. It was a last-ditch attempt to regain leverage. The inspector asked direct questions. Was this snow dumped by the HOA? Did I authorize it? Was the road public or private? I answered calmly and handed over the same survey, contractor logs, and time-stamped photos I'd already used in negotiations. He studied them longer than expected. Then he said something that shifted the entire situation. This road isn't classified as public access. That changed everything. Because the road was privately maintained and partially crossed my land, the city's authority was limited. More importantly, liability didn't fall on the landowner. It fell on whoever created the obstruction. And according to the documentation, that wasn't me. The inspector asked permission to take photos. He noted the snow pile, the boundary markers, and the lack of any city signage. Before leaving, he told me plainly that he'd need to file a report clearing me of responsibility. But that wasn't the end of it. Later that afternoon, I received a voicemail from the HOA's legal counsel. The tone was different this time. Measured, careful, almost nervous. He said the city's inquiry had complicated matters and suggested reopening discussions to finalize cleanup logistics immediately. Translation: the city didn't side with them and now they were exposed. I agreed to one final meeting, but only with everything documented and no side conversations. This time the HOA came prepared with a contractor proposal, full removal, proper disposal, and written acknowledgement of fault. No conditions, no demands. What surprised me most wasn't the proposal, it was the urgency. They wanted it done fast before the city finalized its report. By the end of the meeting, the agreement was signed. Cleanup would begin within 48 hours. The HOA would cover all costs, and they would issue a written notice to residents clarifying that the issue was resolved without homeowner assessments. As I watched the board members leave, I realized how quickly power shifts when facts replace assumptions. The HOA had tried authority, pressure, and misinformation. None of it worked once everything was documented. But just when I thought it was finally over, the cleanup itself triggered an unexpected consequence, one that caught the HOA completely off guard. The cleanup trucks arrived on time, but what they uncovered beneath the snow caused a brand new problem no one was ready for. At sunrise, 3 heavy-duty dump trucks and a loader rolled in, all marked with the contractor's logo. HOA representatives stood at a distance, clearly hoping the job would be quick, quiet, and invisible. Their goal was simple: remove the snow, restore access, and make the entire mess disappear before anyone asked more questions. That plan didn't last an hour. As the loader began peeling away the compacted layers, the operator stopped and shut down the machine. Something underneath didn't look right. What was supposed to be frozen ground was uneven, cracked, and partially collapsed. The foreman waved me over. Beneath the snow pile, the weight had damaged a section of drainage piping that ran parallel to the road. An older system installed long before the HOA existed. The pressure had crushed part of it, causing water to pool and erode the soil underneath. That meant the road wasn't just blocked, it had been structurally compromised. And now it was visible. The foreman immediately halted work and documented everything. Photos, measurements, a written incident note. Because once infrastructure damage is discovered, liability becomes a much bigger issue. Within an hour, the HOA's legal counsel was on site, phone pressed to his ear, pacing back and forth. This wasn't a cleanup anymore. It was evidence. The contractor explained that continuing without an amended work order could worsen the damage and shift responsibility. To proceed, the HOA would need to authorize additional repairs and accept liability for the underlying infrastructure failure caused by improper snow dumping. That's when the panic set in. What started as a cost-saving shortcut had now exposed the HOA to repair claims far beyond snow removal. Drainage repair, soil stabilization, road resurfacing, none of it budgeted, none of it approved by residents. And worse, the damage extended partially onto HOA-managed land. The board tried to argue that the drainage system wasn't theirs. The contractor disagreed. The city records showed the HOA had assumed maintenance responsibility years earlier when the neighborhood expanded. That afternoon, the worksite shut down completely. By evening, residents were asking questions. Why was the road still closed? Why were there inspectors taking photos? Why was the HOA suddenly silent? Because they were scrambling. The next day, a revised agreement was sent to me for review. The HOA would not only pay for snow removal, but also fully fund the drainage repair and road restoration, handled by the same contractor, under a single documented project. They wanted signatures fast. I took my time. Because for the first time, the HOA wasn't trying to pressure me. They were trying to limit damage. But just as the final paperwork was being prepared, one last detail surfaced, something buried deeper than the snow and far more costly than anyone expected. Just when everyone thought the damage was fully accounted for, one final discovery turned a bad situation into a complete HOA collapse. As engineers began tracing the damaged drainage line, they extended their inspection farther down the slope, following the water flow. That's when they found it, an unapproved modification made years earlier during an HOA-led road expansion. A shortcut trench, no permit, no inspection, no city approval. And now, clear evidence that the snow dumping had accelerated a failure that was already illegal. The implications were immediate. This wasn't just about snow anymore. It was about unauthorized construction, concealed infrastructure changes, and deferred maintenance quietly pushed onto residents without disclosure. Once inspectors flagged it, the report went straight to the municipality. Within 48 hours, the HOA received a formal notice. All repair costs would be their responsibility, and a full compliance audit would follow. The board tried damage control, emergency meetings, carefully worded emails, promises of transparency, but residents were already sharing photos, reports, and timelines. What had started as a blocked road had exposed years of mismanagement. The revised settlement was finalized soon after. The HOA paid for full removal, drainage replacement, soil stabilization, and road reconstruction. Independent oversight was added to ensure compliance. The cost was significant, far more than if they had handled the snow properly in the first place. And the fines didn't stop there. City penalties were assessed for the unapproved work. Insurance premiums spiked. Legal fees piled up. Several board members resigned before the audit even concluded. By spring, the road reopened, clean, reinforced, and properly graded. The memorial garden was restored. Access was returned. And a new HOA election brought in leadership far more cautious about shortcuts and intimidation. No lawsuits, no shouting matches, just documentation, patience, and letting the system work once the truth surfaced. The lesson was simple. When authority forgets boundaries, consequences have a way of piling up, sometimes literally. And for the first time since the snow arrived, the neighborhood was quiet again. If you enjoyed this story and want more HOA stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next upload. Thanks for watching, and if you found this satisfying or surprising, hit like and leave a comment with your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think.